Hey, what's up? This is Snapcaster. Received a few requests to break down a bop that I've done, and decided I would just break down the most recent one that I submitted for the bop battle. So I figured we could just listen through it and then go through section by section and just break down some decisions I made, some mixing techniques that I employ, and stuff like that. So without further ado, let's just play this through and talk about it afterwards.
ออกบ้านค้าขายออกไปแต่เช้าเขาก็บ่ได้หุงเศรษฐกิจรัดตัวเมียผัวซอยกันโอละนา แต่เช้าเขาก็บ่ได้หุงเศรษฐกิจรัดตัวเมียผัวซอยกันนะ
Awesome. So to start off, in the very intro, the start section, we just have a vocal sample from the original sample, and it plays in the beginning and the end of the track, and I have just a bunch of effects that kind of wash out into the first drop. I have an erosion, a glitch delay, an echo preset, 2 auto filters, and a redux at the end. And the auto filters kind of just act as a bandpass that opens up as the phrase continues. So it kind of primes the listener to experience the full frequency spectrum as the drop hits. And you can see the automations for each effect here, and it's just sounds kind of like this.
ขายออกไปแต่เช้าเขาก็บ่ได้หุงเศรษฐกิจรัดตัวเมียผัวซอยกันโอละนา
And then I also introduce a horn swell that comes from the original sample. It's just like a long horn sustain that I reversed, and it just kind of builds up into the drop. There's nothing too crazy going on with this effect, just taking out the lows. And I have a delay on here that it's a little trick I use a lot. Basically unlinking the two sides, having one side at as fast as you can put it, 1 millisecond, and then the opposite side at something like 15 or 12, and all the way up in the dry wet, and it just kind of fakes some stereo width. And I do this on anything that I want to be wide, and it can create some problems sometimes. It can create some phase issues if you're not careful with it, and you will either have to go back and fix it or take the effect off. In most cases, it seems to work pretty okay for me, so I just put it on things and hope it works out. And I have it on a lot of tracks in the project. And also leading into the first drop is just a reverse crash, and then a little bit of some white noise effects, and all of that together sounds like this. And that is pretty much it for the very beginning. Let's just try and collapse all this stuff again. I just want to stay organized. Cool, so that leads into the first drop, which all together. So the core of this idea is just this horn stab that goes through the whole first drop and then is introduced with a different horn stab in the transition and the second drop. And it's basically just a piece of a horn stab from the original sample that I found. I put some halftime on it, which is effectively gross beat. Put a little bit of OTT, or a lot of OTT on it, the same delay effect, and a bandpass. And it just kind of sounds a little gross and weird, and that was kind of what I was going for. I wanted it to sound a little off-putting in this section, and then get a little bit nicer melodically as it goes. And then the backbone of the drop obviously is the drums, and they sound like this by themselves. So the drum group itself doesn't have a whole lot going on. It's just a glue compressor, and I have some effects that are brought on in the outro. But as far as like individual drums, they have a kick and a snare. I try and find snares that have a lot of character, and if they don't have a lot of character, I will try and add some character. And for this snare, it's one of my favorite snares. I just have it transposed down 9 semitones and then threw an OTT on it. And the OTT brings out that tail, which I think sounds really cool. And I just brought up the highs a little bit because I wanted to really accentuate that hiss at the end. And as far as kicks go, I like to layer them with a hi-hat or a little piece of white noise to give it a little bit more sizzle. And the kick is just saturated a little bit, and the hi-hat sample of the white noise is delayed, so it's super wide. And for the snare, I also layered it with a clap, just because I felt like the snare by itself didn't smack hard enough. I wanted it to be a little bit more prominent. So did that. And for a lot of my drums and other elements that aren't bass elements, like kicks or 808s, I'll use my reverb send, which I have down here. It's just a Valhalla room. I'll change the decay depending on obviously what I'm going for in the track. Make sure to high pass the reverb, and then I compress it a bit just because I want it to be consistent. And a really important part of my drums that I like to incorporate anywhere I can are tom fills. I think it's really important to try to utilize the whole drum kit whenever you can. And I like sprinkling toms in anywhere that I can. And I think it just keeps the drums interesting. It keeps the track moving. It lets the viewer or listener kind of look out for little pieces of ear candy as it goes. And as far as other fills, I'll use drum breaks like this one, or snare rolls and stuff like that. Another piece of the snare is this reverse snare that just kind of builds into the snare hit. It sounds kind of like this all together. Of course, cymbals are important, so having crashes, hi-hats, and then open hi-hats and rides, also really important. Again, just want to use the full drum kit whenever you can. And for the closed hi-hat, I have a frequency shifter on it, just tuned down a little bit because I liked how it sounded. And for really hissy cymbals, I like to use the same delay effect. It's actually not on the crash, but on this open hi-hat, it is. And of course, this wouldn't be a Baauer bop without a layer of perks, just miscellaneous perks. Found this, and I have it just kind of going throughout the whole course of the actual meat of the track. So yeah, that's pretty much the whole drum configuration for both drops. Then the 808 with the drums. I like super distorted and dirty 808s. So I have just a decap 808 that I'm sure a lot of people use. I always put erosion and saturation on my 808s. Sometimes I'll actually just full on distort them. I love what the wide noise erosion does to an 808 sound. And something I like to do a lot on my 808s is to just jam it through a limiter and a soft clipper at the end, which keeps the tone consistent no matter what note you're hitting. So it's always the same volume and the same presence. And I think that's pretty effective. And as far as leveling my 808s or any sub frequency on the master, I'll use a span. And the range I really want to hit is this -30. This is kind of the gold standard. This is like the sweet spot for sub frequencies. If you can get it to fluctuate around this -30 line, your sub frequencies will be leveled pretty well. That seems to work for me a lot. So altogether, that's what that sounds like. And sometimes I'll layer on some extra white noise on top of my 808s just to add even more sizzle, because that's just the sound I like. So I have this white noise layer that follows the 808 pattern. And it's, EQ to taste, same delay effect, and then some saturation after the fact. And one other piece of white noise that I like to use a lot is just an ambience white noise effect that goes through the entire meat of the track. And it's this super low white noise layer that just is persistent and exists throughout. And it kind of creates a floor for noise in the track so that things feel consistent, and it just adds presence to the whole presentation, and it makes simple mixes feel more intentional, which is a cool trick. And of course there's just a white noise down effect here. Just helps to introduce the phrase. And then at the very end, I have these background vocals that are going on throughout the whole course of the track. And this is just some more background sounds that kind of add to the groove and add to the bounce, but aren't super present or noticeable. It just adds to the atmosphere of the track and keeps things interesting. So again, all together for this section, everything kind of combined together. And then in this group, for the B section of the first drop, I have this sample that I found in the original sample that is just kind of adds some flair to the horn riff, and I just kind of like how it like that little section is nice. And I also used granulator on one of the vocal sections to create this and it acts as just like a little piece to introduce into the B section of the first drop so that it keeps it interesting, isn't the exact same thing copied again. And then also the horn swell to get out of the section and into the transition. So together, this stuff sounds like this. Oh, oops, here we go. Cool. So then on to the transition section. We have a vocal run that I found in the original sample that a lot of people seem to use in their bops, and it is just an unedited section. I have it just completely drenched in reverb, a lot of OTT, some light EQing, and then the glue compressor to make it a little bit louder, a little bit more prominent. The same swell here that's also used later on. And then I also switch up the horn stab to a different sample from the original sample, but it has the same motif and it has the same riff. So it's oscillating from the high octave to the low octave, but it's the same offbeat. And that just keeps the theme alive in the track and carries on into the second drop. For the drums, they're pretty stripped back in this section. Not really much going on, really. A consistent clap, just to keep the drive going. And then I use this break fill to get into the drop. Cool. The 808 switches up a little bit in this section. It's pretty similar to what it was in the two drops. It's still erosion, saturation, limiter, and G-clip. It's just a little bit quieter and then doesn't have an additional white noise layer on top of it. And it's ringing out longer. Sorry, you might not be able to hear that. It's ringing out longer here, so it feels like a consistent tone rather than these really short 808s in the drops. And something I like to do sometimes in the white noise transition effects, and then actually the transitions themselves, are to delay them by a measure so that it kind of keeps the listener guessing, so that things don't always come in on the one. Sometimes you can delay things to get a a cool effect. So transitioning out of the drop into the transition, and then actually having everything kick in at this second measure. And I do that again here, halfway through the second drop. Just a pretty easy way to keep things interesting. And then, of course, the vocals are doing the exact same thing through the transition and all the way into the second drop. And there's nothing else in the second drop, really, that wasn't in the first drop, except for this horn section, which is doing the same thing it was before, but it's using the sample from the transition. And it's still oscillating up and down an octave, but it's also using the same riff from the first drop. So it sounds like this. It's pretty cool. And in the this little effect here is just the same thing as the slow version from the first drop. It's just twice the speed and up an octave, and it goes throughout the whole drop. And it acts as a really nice backdrop to the whole drop as it continues. Pretty cool. And the lead that goes on in the second part of the second drop is the same thing as the transition vocal sample, but I edited it a bit so it sounds like a synth. So I think callbacks to other things are important. So making sure that we're calling back to this vocal sample so it doesn't feel so out of place. Using an auto filter to introduce the effect so that it doesn't just come in abruptly. And to get that synth sound, I use a vocoder. You can put it on pitch tracking, precise mode, 40 bands, bring the depth down a little bit, bring the formant up a little bit. And I decided to make it 50% dry wet so that you could still hear a little bit of the original sample in there, but you can also bring it up to 100% and get the full effect. And you can change the wave as well. Which is pretty cool. There's also a pitch function here. Which is pretty cool. The reason I chose 50% and then didn't use the pitch, but also pitched it up an octave in the sample itself, was that I wanted the vocal effect from the original sample mixed with the synth sound so that they kind of blended together better. But I also wanted to make sure that both were at that higher octave. So if I brought it up 12 here and then brought it at 50%, you would still hear the original sample at the original octave, and that wasn't the effect I was going for. But it works as a really cool lead over the second part of the drop, calls back to the transition, and just adds a little bit more dimension and dynamic sound to the drop itself. Other than that, everything else is the same. There's the same white noise presence, white noise over the 808. The 808's the exact same, vocal samples. And that leads us to the outro, which is also the same as the intro. It just has a little bit of redux on it so that it kind of destroys itself as it ends. It sounds like this with the redux.
ออกบ้านค้าขายออกไปแต่เช้าเขาก็บ่ได้หูเอ้ยเศรษฐกิจรัดตัวเมียผัวซอยกัน
And as far as the actual composition and mixing of these tracks, that's pretty much it. I have 4 return tracks that I can go over here. I have a reverb, a delay, which I'll mess with this too, depending on the track that I'm working on. And I have a kick snare, or a kick compressor and a snare compressor. And these operate as parallel compression for both. So, any kick I have, I'll just put 100% on the return track to the kick compressor. Just makes the kicks punch really hard. And then same for the snare. Any snare layer, all 100% to the snare compressor, and then have some parallel compression on the snares, so that those 2 elements, which are arguably the most important elements of any track like this, can punch through super hard. And then on the master, I have bass clef on everything, just as a transition element. You could also use Endless Smile, which I don't have, but it's basically just a grain delay, some EQs or auto filters, a reverb thing, and it just kind of all comes in at once, so it washes stuff out as it builds, and then you can take it away immediately and have whatever drop or next section hit super hard. As far as the actual mastering goes, I just have a utility, a tiny amount of OTT, and a glue compressor that I use as a limiter. And I don't really do any gain staging, which is probably not a good thing, but I'll just slam a utility on the master, bring it down so it's not in the red, and then go from there. Make sure bass is in mono. The OTT at 10% is hardly noticeable. It's just kind of a habit. People say obviously don't put an OTT on the master, but I think at 10% it's fine. And then the glue compressor is a really good soft clipper. Sometimes I'll use ozone, but for this case I felt like it wasn't necessary. If you bring the range down to 0 and the soft clip on, it won't actually do any compression, but it still acts as a limiter because of the soft clipper. So no compression is actually happening. It's basically just a gain increase, which is pretty cool. But the soft clipping on the glue compressor is really good, so that's pretty much all I'm using it for. And I have it up 11 dB just so it's as loud as I want it to be. And when you're using the soft clipper from the glue compressor or the saturator, or any soft clipping from Ableton stock effects, you want to bring your master down by 0.1 or 0.3, depending on your comfortability, because it still goes over a little bit when it's oversampled from going to an MP3. So you want to just compensate for that. And then I have a span on the master, which I use to just look at my waveform. And like I said, the -30 is kind of the sweet spot for the high end and the low end. So of course there are peaks, and this is just due to my mixing. I could probably, somebody better than me could go in and take these peaks out, and it'd probably sound a little bit better. But generally speaking, the trend is to have this mound hit at around 30, and then have this one hit around 30. And when I do those things, it seems to level out pretty okay. So it's just something I do, and it seems to work. And that's pretty much it. I can put the original sample in the description if you want to listen to that, but original samples here, and this is the whole thing. So if I didn't cover anything you actually wanted me to cover, definitely let me know, and I can either make a second video that goes over those things specifically, or I can try and do better next time. But yeah, this is the bop that I did most recently, and thanks for watching.